Hello and welcome everyone to the ECIST curriculum. The first one we've got our esteemed colleagues Dennis and John, who are going to kick us off with this. So the first one's just talking about the last team meeting that you might recall. We did a bit of a Menti to work out what are the areas people feel the most strongest or least confident in, and local authority and local government was one of the ones that popped up there. So we thought it'd be really useful to have a bit of an overview of the local authority, local government, some of the challenges to charging reforms, which obviously came to focus in the election debates this week, which we got an interesting interpretation. So we'll hear from John around that, and then he's going to kick us off with some of the local government. So will be time for questions at the end, and we've got a bit of a survey for everyone as well, just to make sure that we're continuously improving how we do this and to get some sort of feedback on it all. Hope that's all okay for everyone, and I'll hand over to Dennis, I think.
Thanks, Lee. Can I have my first slide up, please, Crystal? So the brief for this session was to give an overview of local government, and I should introduce myself. For people who don't know me, I'm Dennis Holmes, and I'm head of improvement. My specialist subject is adult social care and community services. And before I joined the ECIST team, I worked in local government for 34 years, and I was a DAS. And I'll give you some reflections on my experience of being a DAS in local government towards the end of the presentation. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give an overview of local government as a whole. This only applies to English councils because there are slightly different arrangements that apply in Wales, quite different arrangements that apply in Scotland, and very different arrangements that apply in Northern Ireland. So this presentation is solely concerned with English local government. And I don't intend to read the words on the slides out to you. You can read the slides for yourselves, and hopefully the slides will be circulated afterwards. But I'm trying to give an overview of a kind of range of stuff that local government is responsible for. And there's probably things that you as citizens who live in local government areas will be aware of anyway. But I thought it'd be good to kind of try and give the broadest possible view of local government and not make any assumptions about how much or how little you know about local government arrangements. There's some interesting things in there about what local government does. As far as the ECIST team's concerned, we'd probably focus on adult social care, perhaps to a lesser extent public health, and perhaps to an even lesser extent children's services. But there is a whole range of stuff that local government is responsible and accountable for besides those big areas of activity in children's and adult services. Licensing being a really important one. There wouldn't be a pub or club open in any part of the country if it wasn't with the approval of the local authority. And so I think we should all give heartfelt thanks for their diligent attention to the needs of local people as far as that's concerned. But kind of joking aside, there's things like environmental health, which underwrite food quality in takeaways and restaurants. And it really is a set of activities that kind of hold the fabric of local communities together. It says that local councils are the most common type of local authority, and I think to a large measure that's true. But we can't disregard the work that's done by parish councils and district councils, which are much closer and more engaged sometimes in the work of the communities that they do. And the work of those entities is often overlooked. And I suppose at one end of the scale is your parish and district councils, and at the other end of the scale are the mayoralities that have been brought into being over the last 15 years. And predominantly the London mayoralty, Greater Manchester mayoralty, Liverpool and Merseyside mayoralty, East Midlands mayoralty. These are mayoralities that increasingly play a really significant role, particularly around transport and alongside that economic development, and are potentially going to play a much bigger role in the future, potentially. I should say, if there's anything that I say that's you don't understand, then stick a comment in the chat box, and I'll try and elucidate as best I can. If I can have the next slide, please. sort of, I've kind of mentioned in passing the kind of range of local authorities that exist in England, and this is from the Local Government Association, which actually enumerates the types of council and the numbers of councils. Some of the county councils are very big. So in my neck of the woods, we've got North Yorkshire, which is a huge county council, covering from 12 miles from the Morecambe Bay right the way across to just shy of Middlesbrough on the other coast, all the way down to Selby, which is just on the outskirts of Leeds. So it is an enormous area, covers a huge range of health facilities in that county, but also has a huge rural infrastructure to manage as well. And I think that there is an interesting dichotomy between the way that urban local government and rural local government are obliged to operate, given their kind of geographic parameters, which are quite different in nature. And to bring it back to the ECIST world and the kind of hospital flow stuff, I've made reference previously in my work to the difficulties that are faced by rural communities to provide the kind of intermediate care infrastructure and the domiciliary care infrastructure that urban centres sometimes find much easier. And so I think it's an interesting perspective, the dichotomy between the challenges faced by rural county councils and the challenges faced by urban councils. You'll see there 63 unitary councils, which are combinations of two-tier authorities, 33 London boroughs, all of which are incredibly diverse, and 36 metropolitan boroughs, which in their own ways are very diverse as well. The combined authorities is a voluntary collection of authorities who come together to organise things like buses and to some extent trains, and to a large extent they've been overtaken by the mayoralities that I referred to previously. Next slide, please. This is my Professor Whitty moment. I've been looking forward to this all week. So councils are run by elected councillors who will come from a variety of different backgrounds and a variety of walks of life. Most councils will be run by the party that gets the most votes, but not necessarily. In recent times, we've seen coalitions of different parties running councils. We've seen large groups of independent councillors who represent very local interests and don't represent national parties form the majority groups on some councils. But generally speaking, councillors are people who come from relatively ordinary walks of life and who are generally there to serve the needs of their local population. Once the biggest group has formed after an election, the leader of that group will generally become the leader of the council. And the leader of the council has a significant and very important role to play, because they become the person who is accountable for the operation of that council. They have a key role in appointing the chief executive of the council, who's the head of the paid service, and they hold a number of statutory responsibilities and accountabilities. They and their colleagues will determine who the portfolio holders become, and the portfolio holders themselves become quite important because they take accountability for that particular area of service. Now, each council will carve that up in its own particular way. Commonly, you will have a portfolio holder for example, adult social care and public health, a portfolio holder perhaps for economic development, a portfolio for children education, for example. There's no firm rules about what your portfolio holders are, but your council will have them. Many councils will form a cabinet style of governance for their council. So the leader of the council and the portfolio holders will form the cabinet, as it were, much in the same way that the central government cabinet is formed of the Prime Minister and the ministers accountable for the offices of state. There are a range of national statutory legal responsibilities that sit with some of those portfolio holders, and they exercise their responsibilities through a kind of committee structure in most councils, and the committee structures provide policy making functions, decision making functions, and scrutiny functions by which the policy and the decisions that are implemented can be overseen by councillors, and their accountabilities can then be discharged appropriately. The leader of the council and the senior elected members are responsible for appointing a chief executive for the council. The chief executive has a whole set of statutory responsibilities. He is the head of the paid service and is effectively responsible for all the employees of the council. The employees of the council conduct their business through a scheme of delegation. So the officers are delegated to do their work by the elected members. Officers can't go off and just do as they please. They can either do what they're allowed to do under the scheme of delegations, or they have to ask permission to do it from elected members. So it really is the elected members who are in control. It's the officers who will obviously seek to influence the elected members, but the elected members have accountability for what happens within their council area. I don't want to gloss over the kind of statutory, the national statutory apparatus. As you will know, the Secretary of State for whatever it's called these days, it ends with levelling up, does have some powers of statutory intervention, but they are limited. And the circumstances in which the Secretary of State can implement those interventions is limited. And then there are the regulators, CQC and Ofsted, who can make requirements on local government, but they can't instruct local government as a whole to do anything that local elected members don't want to do. And I think there's sometimes a misconception within NHS organisations that somebody must have control over local government and must be able to direct local government in what it does. And that's a really serious misunderstanding of the way that local government operates. Local government is largely autonomous, and it doesn't really matter who tells it what to do. If it decides it's not going to do it, it's not going to do it. There could be bad consequences from it doing that, but that is how it is. The chief executive of the council will have a senior leadership team around him or her, and they will likely be the directors of the main service areas. So things like city development, the built environment, communities and neighbourhoods, adults and children respectively, obviously, and various other portfolios. But importantly, legal services. So there will be a chief legal services officer who's responsible for the governance of the council and all the legal matters that the council's responsible for. And then there'll be a finance officer who's called a Section 141 officer, who has accountability for making sure that the council at the end of each financial year has balanced its books. Local government cannot run a deficit. It's got to balance its books at the end of every financial year. And if it doesn't balance its books, it gets into the kinds of difficulties, and I hesitate to say this, that Birmingham has gotten itself into, and a couple of other local authority areas. There's also usually a planning officer who's got delegated authority to approve plans for the built environment and stuff of that nature. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk about money. Where does local authority get its money from? So there are grants, fees and charges, but the two biggest areas of fundraising for local government are generating money through raising the council tax and generating money from business rates. Council tax, obviously, which we probably all pay on this meeting, was implemented in 1991 as a knee-jerk response to the runaway success of the poll tax. And interestingly, the council tax bans and the way the council tax bans are implemented hasn't changed since 1991. It seems nobody in central government has had the ambition or enthusiasm to change or adjust the council tax system in the last 33 years, which seems a bit of a shame, really. Seems like a bit of a missed opportunity, but there you go. If you want to change your council tax thresholds, then you've got to have a referendum. The other thing that's been introduced in recent years is the precept where local authorities are allowed to charge more council tax, which is hypothecated for adult services, adult social services, which I think is you can go up to 5% of your council tax increase to generate additional money for adult social care. Next slide, please. This is the other main source of income, and this explains about how councils raise money from local businesses. Obviously, the bigger the business you are, the more business rate you'll pay. So big town centre and out of town mall type developments generate a lot of business rates for local government. Regrettably, from my perspective, half the business rates that are generated go back to central government and are then hypothetically doled back out to local government as grants. But although the government promised that local government would be allowed to keep all the business rates from 2020, that commitment hasn't been implemented. It's be interesting to see what happens after the election, to see how much enthusiasm there is for adjusting either council tax or business rates to provide local government with more resources. Next slide, please. When I was a much younger man and fully engaged in local government, the local authority that I worked with was significantly dependent on government grants for its funding. Since 2010, the government since 2010 have adjusted the basis on which local government gets its money, so that the preponderance of money that's generated now comes from business rates and council tax, with a much smaller contribution from central government grants. And as you can see here, the core funding the local government association estimates from central government to local government has reduced by 15 billion in the last decade. Just in terms of my local authority, Leeds, when I left Leeds in 2015, the gross budget of the council was just shy of £500 million, 500 million, and the gross budget for Leeds today is just shy of 4.2 billion. So there's a significant amount of money that's been taken out of local government over the past 15 years. Some effort has been made to target grant funding back into local government, but there's quite a big disparity to where that funding actually lands. It would be wrong to say that the grant funding that's been provided back to local government from central government has been evenly spread across all local authorities. Some local authorities, some councils have not been as badly affected as others through that process. Again, to take it back to the work that we do, the Better Care Fund is an example of money that's been earmarked from a government agency, in this particular instance the NHS, and a set of arrangements have been put in place for that money to be expended within a local government, a council context. There are others, and the Local Government Association has identified about 448 of similar types of grant that have been earmarked for local government. And then finally, there's the Levelling Up Fund, which is a capital grant programme, which local government has to apply for to enable it to access that body of funding. And I think the Public Accounts Committee have determined that only 50% of the Levelling Up Fund has actually been accessed since it was set up in 2019. Next slide, please. Capital revenue and reserves. Obviously, councils have a capital budget. The built environment requires maintaining. Equipment needs to be purchased to maintain the built environment. Roads need to be surfaced, resurfaced. Lines need to be painted. Houses need to be repaired. Things of that nature. So every council will have a capital fund. It also funds IT infrastructure for councils and the support of the IT infrastructure. But I've put the additional information there about councils have extensive borrowing powers. So councils can borrow often at preferential rates, which means they can buy stuff like buildings to generate revenue, which they can then invest in services. So the example I gave, there are probably better examples, but a good example is if a council buys a car park, it has a capital outlay that it can borrow money to purchase. It'll probably pay quite a low rate of interest on that borrowing. And from the car park, it will generate a constant revenue stream, which is important. It's a way that councils use capital to generate revenue that they can invest into services. I make the point that most money is raised by councils used for revenue funding of services. Mostly to pay the wages of staff, but also to pay services. And if you hear about local government having to make savings, local government can only make savings from not paying staff. It can't decide it's not going to pay, for example, for people who live in long-term care facilities, but it might decide that it doesn't need analysts, it might decide that it doesn't need accountants, it might decide that it doesn't need solicitors. It's those kind of back office functions that get cut to save money, and which ultimately have an effect on frontline services. How much money you get as a director of a service area depends very much on how much political support you've got for your service area. And around December every year, there's a bun fight between the director of the different service areas to try and wrestle their portfolio holder into submission, to go into the cabinet and argue uphill and down dale that they deserve additional funding in the next financial year, or they deserve not to be asked to save as much as they've been asked to save in previous years. A lot of time is taken up at service director level, having those arguments with your colleagues, and then suffering the consequences if you win that argument from your colleagues for the next 12 months. Councils must hold a reserve. I made the point earlier that councils have to break even at best, but they also have to have a reserve which is at least 5% of their overall budget. And I previously made mention of Birmingham. This is what happened in Birmingham. Birmingham's predicted expenditure exceeded its revenue budget and its reserves, and therefore it was placed into administration by the Secretary of State and is now being run by administrators. And just finally, to wrap up, there's a couple of slides that I wanted to show you. Next slide, please. So you probably won't be familiar with this. It's a bit niche, but it's back in the day, the graph that I used with my portfolio holder to influence the council to not cut adult social care as much as they had planned to cut it. And it's called the Baret Graph of Doom. And you'll see that the Chief Finance Officer in Barnet, on his £300 million budget, predicted that by the year 24-25, which is this financial year, Barnet's expenditure on children's and adult services would exceed the totality of its budget. Now, this was a really powerful tool in having an argument with my colleagues in the council that adult social care really should be invested in, because otherwise, if we didn't invest in adult social care, we wouldn't be able to do anything about this inexorable increase in expenditure. But the next slide shows what actually happened. Thanks, Crystal. So you can see that the dotted lines kind of track the anticipated progress of the Barnet gross budget downwards. But you can also see that expenditure on children's services has stayed relatively steady, as has expenditure on adult care services. But even having taken all that into account, at today's prices, adults and children still consume about 60% of Barnet's budget, and 60% from the research that I did before I put this presentation together is at the lower end of the spectrum. At the top end of the spectrum, some local authorities are expending 75% and possibly slightly more on children's and adult services. And in some local authorities, that expenditure is tracking up. So local government faces a number of challenges going into the future, and we can only hope that the election brings some clarity to how local government is going to be supported to execute its responsibilities and accountabilities in the future. And I think that's my half hour up, and I hope that was helpful.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dennis. We'll probably just keep on straight going, if that's all right, and to John, then we'll have all the questions at the end. Also do feel free to stick them in the chat box as we go along, because I think they'll probably be able to answer them between Dennis and John. Brilliant. Thanks, Dennis. And over to you, John.
Right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm John Woods. Like Dennis, I'm a social worker by trade and part of the ECIST team. But I also in the past worked in the DH when they were developing the Care Act, which is why I get asked to talk about things like this. And this, I think, is one of the challenges Dennis referred to, or could be. We can move on to the slide and I'll start talking about where it comes from. There's a long history to various governments promising to review and improve the funding of adult social care, and it's kind of been split into two parts. Some of it's been talking about they'll properly fund it so that we can increase what we pay to care workers, so we'll get them when we can, etc., etc. But there's also a lot about charging, whether the charging regime is fair and how many people pay for their own care. So there's a long history of them promising to do that. It's been manifest their commitments in every election for the last, I don't know, decade or more, few decades, but none of them have ever delivered on it. It stayed the same. When the Care Act came in, which was heralded as being the biggest revolution in social care law ever, it came up again. It was a bit of a misnomer, really, so it was revolution. A large part of the Care Act was just tidying up legislation. Adult social care had like 60 years of different bits of law coming in, balanced on top of each other, some that contradicted each other, etc. And some of them were really old, like over 60 years old. The 1948 Act, being at the time, was one of the most powerful acts that gave local authorities powers to do. So even just things like the language was rubbish and you wouldn't want to use it. So they tidied it all up. So it wasn't really that revolutionary, but it was very necessary. It was a good thing to do, and they did make some improvements and some changes. One of them being personalisation. So squeeze into a bit of a soapbox of mine. That's about where people who need care and support get to have some say in how that's going to be delivered. They're supposed to be told how much money is available to meet their care needs and have as much say as they want or are able to in how that'll be delivered, as long as they still achieve the outcomes identified in their assessment. I don't think that's happened in the way that the law envisaged, and part of my reasoning, my belief as to why that didn't happen, was the fact that that came in just after the coalition government, and we started the years of austerity, and getting people to change practice when they're getting squeezed even harder on their finances needs somebody who's prepared to take risks, and that's not really what local authorities are about in their DNA. But anyway, back to the point. Another big plank was funding reform. There's a lot of noise about it. They prior to the writing of the Act, they commissioned this guy called Andrew Dilnott, who's now Sir Andrew Dilnott. He wasn't a social worker, he was a finance man, to look at funding and particularly charging in adult social care. And he wrote a fairly damning report and said it was catastrophic. He referred to catastrophic costs that people would incur if they had to fund their own care, and basically said it was a disgrace and it had to change, and suggested ways of changing it. And he suggested a cap on how much people would ever pay, regardless of how much money they have, of 35,000. It got cross-party support in general. In principle, it got cross-party support. They didn't like the numbers, but they said this needed to happen, and it was written into the Act. Different numbers that I'll come on to. And it actually went through Parliament, both Lords and Commons, and was approved. And it is law, it's on the statute book, but it's never been enacted. They delayed it because of the complications of implementing it, which you'll hear about in a minute. They delayed it quite a long time. They did say it was going to be enacted in 23, and there were plans starting to happen for that, but then they delayed it again. The blame's the wrong word, probably. The reason the government or the DH gave for that was that they had representation from ADAS, the Association of Director of Adult Social Services, that the councils weren't ready. But I think it was useful to have that reason. But they said there's only a short delay, and they said it's going to happen now in 25. Whether it will, I think it's another matter. Dennis has already mentioned what happens after the election remains to be seen, and who's there, and will they honour previous people's commitments. They'll say it has got cross-party support, so we'll see. Moving on, we'll talk about what it actually is, and get the next slide. This is the system now. If anyone out there has worked in adult social care charging teams, they won't think this is correct, because it is vastly more complicated than this. But basically, the way it is now, people have got assets above 23,250. They'll end up paying for their care. They become what we call self-funders. If they're below that, they get an assessed charge, and they pay a proportion of the cost depending on how low they've dropped towards the lower limit of 14,250. So their income and other things come into play, but that's basically it. The value of their property counts if they're in residential care of some kind, not at home. People often get that wrong and believe that they could lose their house even if they're getting domiciliary care, which is not true. It's not counted, because obviously you need your home to live in. I think very relevant is this often comes as a surprise to people when it happens. Adult social care is a bit of the kind of thing people don't want to look at because they hope they never need it. And then when they do and find out they're also going to be charged for it, it's a bit of a shock. They don't like it. They thought, particularly when we're talking about nursing care, they thought that was part of the NHS and be free, so it leads to a lot of friction. They see it a lot. The vast majority of the public see it as unfair, and you often get people you put in the argument for, well, if my loved one had cancer, then the government will pay for his care, but he's got dementia, which is also a disease, and you won't pay for his care. So tell me how you can justify that. And it's a difficult argument to have, but it's a reality. The funding's kind of set like that. That's how it happens. It's also very emotive. People get particularly upset when they realise that what they thought was going to be an inheritance they were leaving for their children is actually going to get whittled away by their care costs. And they feel really bad about that. It's something they'd worked for that they can't do. And no surprise, their children, who are probably in their 30s, more likely 50s, also get quite upset about it, and it leads to quite a bit of friction. So that's it as it is now with those numbers. Next slide. So the proposal is for quite significant changes, and the first is that they'll put, which is a brand new bit, they'll put this cap on care costs. You remember that Dilnot said that should be about 35,000. Well, they said 86,000, which is quite a bit more. Even a social worker can do those sums. And what they say is, from October next year, if you're funding your own care, once you spend 86,000, you won't have to spend any more. The government will take over. As we'll see when we get into the detail, that's not quite true, but that's the headline. I think more significantly, they're increasing the upper and lower limits. So the 23,000 goes up to 100,000. That's a significant rise, and that brings a lot of people who would otherwise be completely self-funders into a shared funding, where they'll have a contribution to make, but the council will be paying some of that. The lower capital limit doesn't rise as much, goes from 14 to 20, but it's that gap between 20 and 100 which is significant, because it will bring a lot more people into the local authority remit. There's also, which for some reason gets the least press, this, I've called it a right to request. I know that phrase is used for other services, but it means that somebody who's going to fund their own care can turn around and say, yeah, okay, I understand that, I will fund my own care, but I want you to commission it, you to find it. And they might want to do that for two reasons. One is it's a nightmare. They don't know how to deal with this system that they've suddenly been thrust into. And the other is the council can usually get preferential rates when they're buying care, or they can at the moment. So the small print, as I've called it, is that person's progress towards this cap won't be at what they actually pay. But firstly, it won't include daily living costs. It's often referred to as hotel costs, the light, heating, food, etc. Because saying everyone has to pay that regardless of their social care needs, which is fine. They arbitrarily set that at £200 across a week across the whole country. But it also won't be determined by what they actually pay. It'll be determined at a rate the local authority said they would pay if they were commissioning the care. And there is likely or almost certainly going to be a significant difference between those two rates. It's a good example is it's certainly not uncommon, certainly not in the southeast, to be paying £2,000 a week for a residential nursing home bed privately, and the councils might get that for significantly less. Even half in some respects. So that difference is going to be significant. And there's also a new bit they put in this time round that wasn't in the original, which is partial self-funders, people who are paying an assessed charge. It's only their assessed charge that counts towards the cap, not the amount the council pays, where initially it was the whole cost of their care. It doesn't seem a big difference, but it's going to mean it'll take an awful lot longer for people to reach the cap. There's also the process. The process for people who are funding their own care is not legally they have to be any different to people who are being funded by the council. So there's an assessment got to be carried out, and this is where for me the rub comes in. How many people will want to have that assessment, either because they've come under the threshold or because they want to get metered towards the cap? An example, I used to work for Surrey County Council. It's got a very large independent care sector, and we knew that 80% of the people living in those homes were self-funders. That's an awful lot of people in the population of well over 1 million. How many of those are going to come for assessment? If they all do, the councils will be absolutely swamped. We know some won't. Some will have so much money they don't care. Some just won't want to allow a social worker to poke their nose in, and they won't do it. But we think a significant amount will be. So who's going to do it? Well, clearly it's not the current workforce. Current workforce can't manage the assessments they're asked to do now, so they're not going to be able to do all these thousands of extra assessments. So something radical's got to happen. And they're looking at different ways. Self-assessment, SSA supported self-assessment. On the other thing, you would get support from somebody to help do it. Trusted assessments or trusted assessors, where they take an assessment that's already done and find there's enough information there to make a determination, or they pay someone else to do it, perhaps from an agency. I could see if it does come to fore, a lot of private organisations suddenly offering to do this work and saying they can do it cheaper than the council, or perhaps in-house, but not in-house in the way we currently know it. You'd have teams of people who all they did was assessments. The current assessors have caseloads and safeguarding investigations and reviews and all sorts of things to do. So this would be a team that just did that. The idea being they get churned through a lot more assessments than the current workers would. Whether that be an attractive job or not, interesting. Anyway, having done the assessment, they'd have to decide the person breaches the eligibility level in the same way that anybody else does, and then come up with what's called an independent personal budget. Where I talked about under personalisation, I give a personal budget. This is called an independent personal budget because it's just a notional amount. They're not going to give it to anyone. But that amount would be what they would think they could have bought the care for if they did, which is already said would be different to what they'll actually be paying. They're also expecting people to pay evidence of what they're paying, which was a new bit. They didn't do it before, so they have to send in invoices and things, which is a chore for people, but also a chore for the council to have to, what they're going to do with all this. They've got to put it into a system somewhere and record it and make sure it's the right amount. The view before was, because of the differentiation in price, the chances of people paying less than the independent personal budget was so slim it wasn't worth it. And it might have been rubbing salt into the wound to keep reminding people what that difference was. But anyway, it's coming in. And the local authority have also got to send out annual statements to people to tell me how much they've currently paid towards the cap and tell them, therefore, how long it will take before they reach it, which again will perhaps bring things into stark reality for people that might be a lot longer than they thought, a lot longer than they think they might have. Next slide, please. It's a case study here. I won't go into it in detail. You can read them now or later. Basically, what it's saying is, here's an example of somebody who, under the current system, if they had to go into residential care, it would cost them this amount. Under the new system, it will cost them a lot less, and they're suggesting that this person would save 118,000 under the new system. That's true if the figures they're giving us are correct. But you can see there's a couple of, well, I think there's a couple of things that might be challengeable. These slides aren't new, but they're not that old, such as living in a property in Hastings that's worth 180,000. don't know, and such as staying in a care home for several years, which isn't the norm. But anyway, you can see there's a suggestion there that's how much a single person would save. And the next case study, please. This is for a couple. It's relevant just because it shows a little bit more about how the financial assessments work. If you're a couple both in care, you'll have shared assets, but that's split between you. You don't get both assessed on the same amount, so it makes a difference. So in this case, this couple would immediately fall below the new threshold of 100,000, so they would get support immediately. But again, we're looking at numbers here that might be questionable. £90,000 house in Burnley, maybe, but the cost of care they're going to get, I think they'd be lucky to get it for that kind of amount. But you see, if those numbers are true, these people would save 37,000 based on the new system. The reason I put those up just to make that how it's going to be sold. That's what people are going to be told how it'll work at the moment. So Department of Health and Social Care are responsible for making this happen. When I first got involved in this, it was called funding reform, adult social care funding reform. Then it was called adult social care charging reform. Now it's just called digitising and streamlining assessments. They don't really talk about the funding side of it so much. And there's a logic to that, because they're saying this is how it's going to make happen. That extra workload that I've been talking about has got to happen somehow. So they're talking about these kind of planks in their plan. One's an uptake in digital tools. What they mean by that is people doing more self-assessment, more online stuff, more off-site things going on. There are some that exist now, but all they do, you could go in and answer a few questions, and it'll say, based on what the answers you've ticked, you look like you're eligible. Or you can, on a different site, you can talk about the cost of your care, and they can say, well, based on what you said, if we were to pay for that care, this is be your charge. But they aren't an assessment. They're just to give people an idea. People then go out and do all the assessments and start from scratch. It doesn't save any time. What they're saying is you'd have to actually accept those somehow. But how would they verify it is the big question. The next about best practice. People are doing those things I talked about before. This is streamlined and proportionate assessments. Yeah, is somebody successfully doing telephone assessments or self-assessments, etc.? And all these changes or differentiations of the way you do assessment are allowed for in the Act. To get to share those, which is a sort of tried and trusted method. We do it all the time, letting people know what they do in a different area, assuming some people do crack the problem, of course. Whether it's about data sharing, all government departments, whether they're central or local, collect lots of information about all of us, particularly financial information, but they don't share it between departments, let alone between central and local government. And they're saying we could actually save a lot of time if we made this happen, and they are trying to make it happen. I'm told there's a pilot in Leeds. Dennis knows about it, but I've not heard how it's gone. There's certainly the people who work in charge and think that would be a great help, because they could kind of validate people's financial information quickly without having to go and scrutinise it all themselves. Lastly, this is my favourite, is they're looking at what's called case management systems, the IT systems, the computer systems that the assessors, the social workers have to fill in. If you've ever spoken to anyone that does that, they probably don't say nice things about it. Very few of them are fit for purpose. They take an inordinate amount of time to complete. I don't think many of them are fit for purpose, or if they are, they were designed for the wrong purpose because of who commissions them. So what they're suggesting is a minimum, they'll come up with a template and say to the IT providers, if you're producing a system for a local authority, it has to include these facets. And it'll be things like being able to pull in information from other systems and input it straight into the system rather than being rekeyed. It'll be things like being able to take information from self-assessments or third-party assessments done offline, not on the council systems, those kind of things, which could be quite useful. And the IT system, people would like that. They'd happily have a template rather than keep redesigning it, although that won't go there. But they're also thinking, which is the bit I love, about developing a national IT system. When I met the bloke online in the group I'm on about this, who's been given responsibility for leading this, a young civil servant, I did ask him what he'd done wrong to get given that job, which he did find slightly amusing because he realised it was quite a big ask. You'll know, as well as I, the amount of success in national IT systems so far is limited, should we say. I also suggested he might go and talk to the post office about how it might work, but he didn't find that one quite as funny. Anyway, that's their approach. Next slide. Bring things to a conclusion while we've still got a little bit of time left for questions. the summary of that is this is a long promised reform. It might be about to happen. I wouldn't put your house on it, frankly. It should affect a large percent of the population who receive care and support, either because they're this cap issue, but for me, it's more about the thresholds. More people are coming to the support of the local authority, and those people will get a lot more help and advice and guidance as to how they might meet their care needs than they currently do if they're self-funders, because they just kind of, well, the phrase often used is thrown to the wolves, but the independent care sector certainly don't like that. But it's a complex area, so getting help is a good idea. How much help you'll be able to give someone if you don't have a quality conversation that you'd have in an assessment like now, like with a telephone assessment or a self-assessment, is debatable though, so that might not happen. For me, the workload implications just can't be overestimated. Those thousands of extra assessments, thousands of extra recordings, finance and care assessments, all the admin, and indeed all the complaints and conflict that I'm convinced will come with it is huge. And those different ideas that I suggested people might use, self-assessment, telephone assessment, whatever, not one of those will do it. You'd have to be using all of those. You'll need a raft of solutions to deal with this tsunami of extra work. There could be an unintentional consequence to the market. What I'm talking about there is those cut price beds. The most large percent of the independent care sector won't sell cut price beds to the local authority. They say this is our rate, take it or leave it. But those that do, it's a cash flow issue for them. They might have 30 beds. They'll only sell 5 to the local authority and 25 privately, and the total income meets their desired profits. If we start as local authorities trying to buy more beds at the reduced rate because people who are metering towards the cap ask for them, or because more people are coming into our remit with the higher thresholds, they're not going to create more beds at a reduced rate. So those beds will get used up. So either the homes will just stop doing that because the pressure is too much and they'll just have one rate, which could be a good thing eventually, but it's a big hump to get over in terms of cost. Or local government will end up finding they've got to pay more because they got more beds they're paying a higher rate for. So that's, for me, a big worry, and I know it is for others. Problems with the deal, I just think it's a big deal. When it came about last time, you had ministers, like it happened to be Hunt at the time, coming on the radio and TV talking about the Care Act and how wonderful it was, and saying things like because of this, people won't have to sell their house to pay for their care. He occasionally said in their lifetime, because some people can get a deferred payment. But that was patently not true for all sorts of reasons, which I haven't got time to go in now. And what he was basically, without meaning to, but he was setting the local authorities up for more conflict when people found out they probably would have to sell their homes, or a lot of them would. But also, if you got a national campaign to explain this, it stops local authorities putting their own spin on it and it getting more confusing. And if it's done properly, so it's really open, people will actually see what's going on. So you reduce the conflict because they understand it at the beginning and they choose if they're going to get into it or not. Whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know. I've asked the question and had some positive answers, but I haven't seen much about it. There you go. There is a slide with some kind of bits of further reading. They're a little bit old now, but they're still valid, I'm fairly sure, if you want to go into the detail. And that's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John and Dennis. That's absolutely brilliant and really enlightening, I think, for most of us on the call today. I'll throw out a chance for us to ask any questions, because I know this is quite an intricate area and a bit of a niche, probably niche, but yeah, it's quite a specialist area. So the opportunity to ask any questions. I'll give it a couple of seconds. I've got one if no one else has. Dennis.
I just want to make a point about where the preponderance of cost on local authorities in children's and adult services is falling right now, because the government concentrates all its energies on older people and whether they have to sell their houses to fund the care or not. Increasingly, the largest item of expenditure in the adult social care budget is young people with disabilities, young adults with disabilities. It's not unusual to have a young adult with a number of different conditions, including learning disabilities and autism, who would cost at least £500,000 and possibly close to £750,000 a year to care for. And in a larger authority, you might expect to have 6 or 7 of those individuals at any given time. So if your total budget for, let's say, contributions for older people in long-term care was 25 million, you might expect at least 25 million to be expended on younger people with disabilities. And it's a growth area. And it will be the thing that puts the most strain on adult social care budgets. And the corollary of that is that there will be a squeeze on the amount of money that is available to expend on older people's services. And so going forward from today, going forward from probably a couple of years ago, that's going to be a really a key balancing act for adult social care systems. And the other thing that's going to be a big challenge for adult social care systems are decisions that are made when those youngsters are children, because oftentimes children's services will agree to place children in specialist settings, often many, many miles away from their home authority. And when those children transit into adulthood, that is sometimes a very unexpected and unwelcome priority for the receiving adult social care service. Imagine you're not anticipating £1 million additional placement and suddenly you're presented with £1 million additional extra placement. So just to put it in perspective, we tend to focus in the ECIST team on older people and around frailty and around domiciliary care and around long-term care. But our colleagues in most adult social services authorities are wrestling with a different but similar set of challenges for younger adults with very particular needs.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful to get that sort of overall insight and context of where this is all taking place. I've got one question with around, I think the NHS is trying to think it's helping by doing bridging services to try and help some of that. What sort of your views on those?
Well, I can give you an example from a few years back. A few years back, Stoke Hospital decided that it was going to purchase its own domiciliary care service for people leaving hospital. And it was completely inattentive to the amount of money that it paid for that domiciliary care service. And the providers in Stoke, who were being paid, let's say, £25 an hour by the trust, then expected to get £25 an hour off a local authority, which the local authority couldn't possibly afford. I think bridging services are fine so long as there's a reasonable prospect that the local area is going to have a capacity in the future to take those people off the bridging service, because otherwise the bridging service itself gets silted up, and that in itself just pushes the failure to flow further downstream. If it's a collaborative effort between the local health partners and the local authority, I think that's fair enough. But I think it's a go it alone initiative. I would very much counsel against it.
Yeah, thank you. John, is that on them?
I just endorse that, really, particularly the last bit. If it's a go it alone bit, as well as the kind of financial implications, they often end up, the staff get moved from one service to the other, so you don't actually increase the resource at all. You just move them around to go to the higher pay. If it's done as part of the market management, which is a local authority responsibility, and whoever's doing this bridging comes into that and looks at the system as a whole, you've got more chance of it being useful. Otherwise, it can be short-term gain for long-term loss.
Brilliant. Thank you. We're out of time, so we have Emily, and then we'll wrap things up to a close.
Hiya, thank you. Just a question: when the funding reforms come into place, and there's the assessments, the change in the amount of assessments and who's entitled for assessment, Do you think that will like impact on the processes in hospital for discharge, or will that continue under D2A and it'll all be managed once people are out of hospital?
It shouldn't, but it probably will. The whole D2A stuff is still not really happening, is it? In the way it was envisaged. This is another soapbox. I have to be careful, but without having properly integrated discharge support services that everyone goes through, it's always going to cause problems. And you shouldn't be doing long-term assessments in hospital, whether it's for the progress towards the cap or whether it's for ongoing care. So if that's happening, then it won't affect it. But it's not happening in lots of places. And if you've got people who are going to self-fund, saying, well, I'm not going to help my mum move out, etc., till I know what the cost is and what you're going to help, etc., and I want all that to happen, then it could do. So we don't know a lot of what the effect is, but I think it could do.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm sure if there's any further questions, I'm sure Dennis and John will be more than happy to sort of answer on email and bits and pieces, but I'm just really conscious we're coming towards the end of this. I just want to say a massive thank you for John and Dennis for taking us through the first session of this. I think it's been really, really useful, massively insightful. I've learned absolutely loads, despite actually talking to you on a regular basis. It's fascinating, always fascinating to hear you talk. So thank you. For everybody else, we have got a bit of an evaluation. I think Chris was just put into the chat box there. It'd be great to get your feedback. This is the first one. We're trying to make sure we get the content and pitch and everything right, and make sure this is feeling right for you. Because this is about us learning, you learning and hearing about these the different things and different challenges in these particular areas. So the more feedback you can get, both good and constructive, then the more we can refine these to what you exactly need. So if you could take a few minutes to do that, would be absolutely fantastic. But otherwise, it's been lovely to see everyone, and hope you have a great weekend when it eventually arrives. Thanks all.